Anyway, so tonight I'm going to talk about the history of slavery and the abolitionist movement, and I think you'll find it interesting, and I've got lots of information that I can't fit into the times, so I may skip past a bunch of slides, and hopefully that won't be too distracting. But with your permission, I'll go ahead and get started. So slavery existed from the beginning of recorded history, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and so forth. Even the beginning of writing, Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian valleys. Right? Take a stick, poke it in clay. That's the beginning of writing. So the very first things that were written have slaves, right? 2050 BC. The word for king is lugal, free person is lu, male slave is arad, female slave is jemi. I mean, so there's always been slavery. Anyway, like I said, I could go through. Here's Hammurabi. He's a contemporary of Abraham. And he said, okay, there's God, king, male nobles, wives of the male nobles, and then the poor, and then the slaves. So there's always been slavery. And here's one, Hammurabi's code says that there's slaves, slave auctions, slaves are tattooed with their owners' names. And then here's Hammurabi's code, law number 282. If a slave says to his master, "You are not my master," if they convict him, his master shall cut off his ear. And then China. In the ancient China, actually in the Shang dynasty, 2nd millennium BC, enslaved neighboring states used captives for ritual sacrifice. And there's a word in the Shang and Dao dynasties, jiamin, which means base or debtor, and so they had slavery. And anyway, Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and then Egyptians had slaves, and obviously the Israelites, and the Gibeonite deception. Instead of Joshua would kill them because they had tricked him into making a treaty, Joshua says, okay, we're not going to kill you, but you will be water carriers and chop wood as a class of people. So that was, in a sense, like slavery. And then India, they have a caste system. And the highest is the Brahmin, they're near divinity, and the lowest is the untouchables, and their job is to clean the sewers. And even if they do a really good job, they can never graduate, and so forth. Ancient Greece, about 40% of Athens was slaves. And then the Romans captured, Julius Caesar was Gallic Wars, went all through Europe and captured people and brought them back into Rome. And the people that he captured were Slavs. That's where you get the word Yugoslav, Czechoslovakia, Slovenia, Slovakia. And the word Slav meant glorious one. It was a name of a people group. But the Romans captured so many of them and gave them away as permanent servants that the word Slav got the connotation of a permanent servant. And of course, we pronounce it slave. And then you had Diocletian, and then Jesus. The movement to get rid of slavery started with Jesus. And he, therefore, all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So if you don't want to be a slave, you shouldn't own a slave. I thought it was interesting, some stories that we're all aware of that we don't really think of. But the most popular Greek Orthodox saint is St. Nicholas. And the Greek Orthodox tradition was that he had decided to, the Pietist movement, remember I talked about that yesterday, that he decided he was going to serve the Lord and give away all his money and join a monastery. But he wanted to give away the money anonymously so God would get the glory and not him. And so he would sneak into town and throw money in the window of poor people. And the famous story was a merchant was bankrupt and the creditors were going to take his 3 daughters and, like repo, but only they'd probably have a life of horrible slavery and prostitution probably. And so Nicholas hears the problem and late one night throws some money in the window, providing the dowry for the girls to get married, and so they don't have to be sold into slavery. And so that became the idea of St. Nicholas visiting at nighttime, and then they threw the money in the window and supposedly landed in a shoe or a stockings that were drying by the fireplace, and we celebrate that tradition. And here's it says, he provides a dowry for 3 girls. So that's where St. Nicholas is throwing the money in the window. And then Constantine stops the persecution of Christian, and then slavery begins to diminish. And then in the 5th century, invading hordes overrun the Roman Empire, and they enslaved the captives. And then a famous story that we're familiar with is Patrick. So Britain was a Roman colony from the time of Julius Caesar all the way up into the 5th century. And then Attila the Hun is scourging Europe. Rome has to pull all of its legions back from the frontiers, and Britain's left unprotected. And that's when marauding bands come and capture people and sell them into slavery. And so Patrick was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Druid, Ireland. And then he escapes, and then he goes back as an adult as a missionary, and he converts 300,000 people and so forth. But it started off with him being a slave. So Patrick was a slave for 6 years in Druid, Ireland. And then you had Patrick writes what's considered the first anti-slavery document. So he gets Ireland all saved, but then there's a British king named Coroticus who is capturing Irish that Patrick brought to Christian faith, and he's taking them and making them slaves. And Patrick condemns this guy and says, you're selling the bride of Christ into a brothel. This is what Patrick writes. The sheep around me are torn to pieces, driven away by these robbers, by the orders of the hostile-minded Coroticus, so forth. Ravening wolves that devour the flock of the Lord. You sell them to a foreign nation that has no knowledge of God. You betray the members of the body of Christ, and so forth. Anyway, then Islam comes along, and they enslave because Muhammad himself owned slaves. Muhammad owned black slaves. In Arabic, there is one word for black person and slave. It's the same word. It's abd or abid, A-B-E-D, abid. And so every black person, the Muslims would call him slave. It's just the same word. And so they enslaved an estimated 180 million Africans in the 1400 years of Islam. Muhammad was white. There are hadiths that when he lifted his arms to pray, they'd see the whiteness of his armpits. And somebody was on his donkey and it rubbed up against Muhammad. He says, I saw the whiteness of the prophet's thigh. And another hadith says some people came to visit Muhammad. They said he is the white man reclining on the couch. And Muhammad owned black slaves. And he sold them. And so it's impossible. There's never been an abolitionist movement in Islam because it would be considered an insult to Muhammad. Now, there have been some that wanted to move away from that, like Ataturk in Turkey, wanted to have a secular state. But as far as the fundamentalist Muslim countries, that's their dilemma, because if they criticize owning of slaves, they're criticizing Muhammad. And Saladin, remember the Third Crusade? You got Richard the Lionheart, and he's got his brother King John is running England. And remember Robin Hood, Sherwood Forest time? And so Richard is over there fighting Saladin, and he almost takes Jerusalem, but doesn't. And they broker to let the Christians out of Jerusalem. And Saladin lets everybody that can ransom their life out, but about 15,000 don't have money to ransom their life, and he sells them into slavery. And twice as many women were sold in Arab Muslim slave trade than men. And they had slave markets. All Timbuktu, where the canoe meets the caravan, the Niger River was a big Arab slave trading port. Khartoum in Sudan, the Zanzibar coast, Tanzania. There's hundreds of Muslim slave markets where they would sell Africans. And anyway, unfortunately, they would have the men take care of the harems, and they would castrate them and so forth. Even David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary to the Congo, would write about going through the jungle and stumbling across 500 Africans shackled together, being forced to march 500 miles to the coast. And if they were walking too slow, they'd slow everybody down because they're shackled together. They just shoot them or kill them. He says you could tell where the slave trails were by looking for the vultures circling. And he says, if anything, more important than discovering the source of the Nile River, if my revelations can get rid of this monster that hangs over Africa of the Arab Muslim slave trade. And Jedediah Morris wrote the first geography books for America. And he writes, the island of Madagascar has several petty savage kings of its own, both Arab and Negro, who, making war on each other, sell their prisoners for slaves and so forth. And then you have the Vikings, and they had boats with low keels, and they would go up every river in Europe, into Russia, all these places where people thought they were safe, and they'd get off their boats, and they'd kill the men and throw the women over their shoulders and sail back to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And so they had slavery, but the captured Christian women would have to have children to these Vikings. And they would raise the children to be Christian. And so after a couple generations, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark became Christian. So ladies, you did a good job there. And then, so slavery when Ataturk set up the modern Republic of Turkey, he did want to secularize it, and so they ended that for a period. So anyway, Europeans, they were captured by the Muslims and sold into slavery. And there were entire Catholic orders called the Trinitarians. The head of the order was called the ransomer, and they would collect alms and donations and go under a white flag to North Africa to ransom your friend back. And then Vincent de Paul was captured about the same time the Pilgrims, or the Jamestown is being founded in America. He's captured and he's made a slave, and he eventually witnesses to one of his master's wives, and she nags the husband to listen to this guy, and they let him go. And he sneaks back to Europe, and he starts an organization, a charity, to raise money at church to ransom back guys like himself who had been in the Muslim slavery. And then he starts the first hospitals. And he has an order of the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, and they run all these hospitals across Europe. The Portuguese, so Columbus, when the Muslims conquered the land routes to India and China, he set sail with a sea route in 1492. But in 1498, Vasco da Gama made it around from Portugal, around South Africa to Goa, India, and opened up trade that way. Unfortunately, he decided to bring back some slaves, and so Portugal got involved in the slave trade. And then pre-Columbian America had slaves. I was talking with Pastor Jack that the first ones over, Columbus's first journey, he met the peaceful Indians. They were called Arawaks. And then on his second journey, he's got 17 ships with 2,000 get-rich-quick people that they land on an island and they see human bones cooking in pots. And they're like, Columbus, you didn't tell us about this. We thought it was all wonderful. And find out that they're Caribs. And they had come up from South America. And they would raid the islands at nighttime and take the women and eat them. And they'd take the boys and they would eat them. And then, anyway, I won't get into all of it. But the Spanish word for a cannibal at the time was related to the word Carib or Caribe. Or piranha. So basically Caribbean Sea had the connotation of a cannibal sea. And then the Aztecs. The reason that Cortez, with just 500 men, was able to defeat him was because the surrounding tribes helped Cortez because they were tired of giving up their young men and women to be taken to the top of the pyramids and have their hearts ripped out, and then their bodies rolled down and people would cannibalize them. And the Cortez's men wrote stories about this, and for a while, for centuries, people doubted it. But just a few years ago, they were digging and doing repairs to the old buildings and cathedrals in downtown Mexico City, and they got way down in the basement, and they uncovered these whole areas of thousands of skulls, and a lot of them are babies, and so they're not captured in war. They were, anyway. So you already had dinner, so I'd be telling these stories. You know, guys sort of like hearing these stories, and ladies don't, and so I'd be at the table, and I'd start, my wife's like, we're eating dinner, don't talk about this. And so, North America, wasn't it a beautiful place before the Europeans came? Well, the Comanches of Texas owned slaves. The Creeks in Georgia owned slaves. The Yurok in Northern California owned slaves. The Pawnee, the Calumet, they all did. I talked to somebody that had been a missionary to the Dakotas, and he talked about their history that every summer, the whole tribe would relocate down by the cliffs, by the river, and to hide the tribe, because the men would go off to raid another tribe to take their women. But while they're gone, another tribe would raid their tribe and take their women. And it was sort of a, anyway. Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. So you got Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, and Aristotle taught Alexander that the Greeks were superior and the other ones were barbarians, and it was okay to enslave the barbarians. And so that's one of the reasons Alexander the Great conquered everything, because he mentally thought that he was superior and they weren't. But this is typical. You had just about every nationality had an equivalent of this. The Inca Empire, in a sense, everybody in the Incan Empire was a slave. Everybody was employed by the state, and the head of the state was Atahualpa, and he was a delegate of the sun god. And so, but it's a natural human tribalism that you have, ancient American history, rather, the Hatfields and the McCoys, right? These are two families that they just kept, for centuries. And then you have, Cubans and Haitians and the Pharisees, Samaritans, they wouldn't go through that. All the Samaritans, they were bad. And I was even in Texas one time, and the big deal is football. And one town will hate the other town because of a football team rivalry. And it's like there's this natural tendency toward tribalism. The gospel comes along and it shakes things up. It says, no, all men are created equal in the image of God, and God is not a respecter of persons, that everyone is to be treated the same. And so Columbus, he takes 4 voyages, and he's convinced he's this close to China. He's trying to fit what, Marco Polo had gone to China in the 1200s, across the Gobi Desert, the China Silk Road, and his book was handwritten before they had the printing press, and they would copy it all, and it became a bestseller, Marco Polo's Journeys. It was nicknamed Il Miliones, which means the million lies, because they said, naked holy men in India. It's like, yeah, right, and then they'd have fields of cloth, and he evidently hadn't seen coal before. He's like, these burning rocks in China, but it was coal. And so Columbus knew there was China, and he knew some rudimentary geography, and so he was trying to fit the Caribbean geography into what he had thought was the China and the Far East, and so he, on his second voyage, he's got these 2,000 get-rich-quick guys, and he leaves his brother in charge, and he's doing some more exploring, and then gets back, and some of them had mutinied, and they went off and took a lot of the natives as captives, and Columbus writes a letter to the monarchs in Spain saying, I need help, and this jealous bishop named Fonseca convinces the king to replace Columbus with a guy named Bobadilla, and so Bobadilla shows up in Cuba and puts Columbus in chains and sends him back in the hull of a ship in chains. And of course, he gets back, the king and the queen take it off, but they're not in a hurry to send him on another trip. But meanwhile, so they enslave more of the natives, and there's a guy named Bartolome de las Casas, and he was a slave raider. He would raid the islands, and he'd take the Indians captive, and they basically set up a feudal system in America like in Europe. So Europe, you have the feudal lord, and his job was to run this plantation, so to speak, with all the people, and he would consider them his servants. And so they set that up in the New World and said, okay, this is my encomienda, and they would make the Native Americans as slaves, make them work in mines, dig for gold, and then with a lot of the European diseases, there was a lot of dying. And so Bartolome de las Casas converted. So he's a contemporary of Martin Luther. So Martin Luther's doing the Reformation over in Europe, and Bartolome de las Casas, he goes and he hears a sermon, and he says, the voice of the crying out in the wilderness, and he convicts him that he's a sinner, taking all these slaves, and so he repents, and he decides to become a priest, and then he spends the rest of his life lobbying to end the enslavement of Native Americans. And he gets a little plantation going where the Native Americans are all farming and becoming successful, and then they get raided by the other ones, and they're killed, and they wipe the whole thing out. But he even does a debate with a Spanish guy named Sepulveda. There's a street somewhere out here named that. And you know what the debate was about? Whether or not the Native Americans had souls. And Sepulveda said that they were not fully human, they really didn't have souls, so it's okay to enslave them. And Bartolomé de las Casas said, no, they're fully human, just like you are. They have souls, and it's wrong to enslave them. And they even made a movie about that called The Controversy of Valladolid. And so finally, Bartolomé de las Casas is successful. Got the King of Spain, got the Pope to make decrees to stop the enslavement of Native Americans. And this is wonderful, but somebody said, well, if we can't enslave them, where can we get slaves? And someone said, Africa. And that began the